McDonald.
Thank you. I rise too to speak on these amendments to the cashless debit card. And I have listened to the speeches over the last day or so and reflected on the lived experience and the passion that so many senators are bringing to this discussion. I did hear an interjection earlier suggesting that in some way this was about extending the debate unnecessarily, and I reject that with all of my heart and soul, because for those of us who live in communities that are marginalised, who are disadvantaged, and not just Aboriginal communities, Noel Pearson, who was one of the people who inspired me to get involved in politics, I heard him speak at a press club function in about 2008, and he talked about these not being issues of race but these being issues of poverty. And this is what was enacted in rolling out the cashless debit card, was to try and assist people who needed additional protections. They needed additional support, not just for themselves, and we heard Senator Henderson talk about women being bashed to get access to social security payments. I'm very concerned about some of the discussion where the minister has been proposing that they'll put a PIN number on social security cards. I mean, isn't that just the same problem as forcing people to hand over the password, the PIN number, to their card? I don't see that solving the problem at all. So, like Senator Canavan, I join him in his congratulations of the government for listening. They have taken so many poorly thought through, paternalistic, idealistic statements to the last election, which they are one by one having to reverse. So at the last lot of sittings, we saw them having to re-establish the Northern Australia Committee. Day one of the new parliament, they abolished the Joint Standing Committee on Northern Australia, and by the end of that following week, we had re-established the committee. This is another example of this thought bubble that is abolishing the cashless debit card would be the right thing to do. And I do congratulate Labor on actually listening, on listening to the speeches, on listening to the examples that are being given, on listening to Noel Pearson and other leaders about why this is such an appalling decision, why they're actually already, by overturning the alcohol restrictions in the Northern Territory, by removing the CDC card, they're actually driving families into terrible, terrible situations. And I know the stories that I hear in the North of young people who are unable to study, who are having to get up early and stay up late at night, looking after their younger siblings, getting them something to eat, helping them get dressed, get to school, and at the price of their own education, where they end up dropping out of school, dropping out of higher education, and missing out on the opportunities that this great country has available to us all if we have the sort of supported childhood that most of us here were fortunate enough to have. So I embrace this embarrassing backflip from Labor, where they suddenly work out what the reality of the world is. They get out of Sydney and Melbourne and whatever protected areas that they've been in, and they understand that in regional parts of Australia, and no doubt out of city places, that people need the support that the CDC extended, because it was a superior welfare card. It had access to 1 million different sites to spend your money in, as opposed to the basics card, which is exactly that. It's exactly that. It is a second-rate, poorly considered alternative to what the CDC is, which is a much enhanced card that allows people to focus, as Senator Canavan said, their hard-earned tax dollars of the Australian taxpayer, that when we provide assistance for this safety net, for welfare, to be spent on housing, on food, on supporting the children, to be educated. These are the important goals of social security, and it is not on alcohol, on grog, on those other expenditure, and that's what the CDC was protecting. So I support Labor's new amendments to extend the CDC back to allow the Cape York communities, the CDC trial sites and those people in the Northern Territory who will voluntarily transition from the Basics card onto the CDC to remain on it. This is a very good starting point, and it is just the first admission that they have messed up with this ill-conceived election commitment. And the amendments put forward by the government confirms that even they admit that abolishing the cashless debit card will have serious consequences for vulnerable communities. I guess what we saw last night when Senator Chisholm attacked the cashless debit card rollout in Hinkler was an example of the lack of informed debate and understanding that has happened. And so Senator Henderson has already read into the record the huge amount of consultation that happened in the electorate of Hinkler in Bundaberg and Hervey Bay. Between May 2011 and 2017, the Department of Social Services conducted over 188 meetings with federal government agencies, community members, local government representatives and service providers. Senator Henderson has laid all of this out, the huge amount of consultation. And so it is truly appalling to have a government senator somehow represent that there was no consultation for that community at all. It is not the case, and in actual fact there is overwhelming support. When ReachTel, an independent survey organisation, surveyed that community, overwhelming support for the CDC. And anecdotally, they're talking about participants having money left over at the end of the fortnight. Some now have savings. Children are going to school with lunch and they have had breakfast. Requests for emergency food hampers has plummeted. These are good outcomes. These are great outcomes that we want to see more of, and to see all of the federally funded services, over 70 existing across the region, which includes drug and alcohol services, financial capability, employment and family and children's programs, just to name a few. So I too want to acknowledge the extraordinary work of the local member, Keith Pitt. He has been attacked by these kind of senseless, ill-informed, ignorant accusations that were again labelled at him yesterday, when he has fought diligently for his community, for the disadvantaged in his community and for the voiceless in his community, particularly the children and the elderly who now were able to feed themselves, who were able to have more money left over and not be abused by family members who were trying to access their cash. So I welcome Labor's backflip and amendments to this CDC, but you now have to wonder, what is the purpose of this legislation at all? What is the purpose for us being here if Labor is just going to slowly and very quietly continue rolling out the advantages of the CDC card right across Australia, a card that the communities say work, a card that has seen more families in better situations and, more appropriately, spending the hard-earned taxpayers' dollars that we are using when we fund social welfare. Because we know that in communities right across Australia there is poor outcomes. In Northern Australia, juvenile crime levels are bordering on the ridiculous, because one of the results of alcohol and drug-fuelled home environments is that children feel safer on the streets than they do with their parents. Cairns and Townsville will smash previous records for stolen vehicles. In Townsville, car thefts jumped 124% in 2020-21 and a further increase of 20% in 21-22. It's a 140% increase in 2 years in Townsville alone, while Toowoomba, the Gold Coast and Brisbane topped the state's car theft dishonour board. In Mount Isa, my much-loved nearly hometown, TripAdvisor is advising against people going to that place. And I know why. Because when you're out in the evenings, the groups of young people roaming the streets because it is not safe at home. There is no food at home. There is no protection and nurturing environment at home, and they are on the streets roaming around. They're stealing cars, they're creating mischief, and they are not ever going to achieve their potential. Father Mick Lowcock, who is a great man in Mount Isa, he picks up young people as they come back from Cleveland Youth Detention Centre. He looks out for them, but he knows that there is only a small number of children that this applies to, but it is children who are not at home because they are not being provided for there. And I would welcome seeing the sort of support that the cashless debit card provides to those children being rolled out to Mount Isa and other communities. People pick up these kids, they drop them at home, they watch them run through the house, down the back stairs and over the fence and onto the streets again. And they have nothing, not enough resources and places to take these kids to. So it is clear that steps must be taken to switch off the access to alcohol and drugs as a first step to addressing a multitude of issues. The cashless debit card does exactly that. We have strong evidence over the past 5 years to show improved outcomes for those who use it and for their loved ones. Less alcohol and drug abuse, less violence and more incentives to find employment. And in effect, Labor's removal of the CDC is opening the door to more cases of children who are not being fed and nurtured at home, who cannot access the advantages of education because they're going to school hungry. They're going to school hungry without breakfast and no lunch, and eventually drop out of school altogether. By banning the purchase of alcohol and gambling products via the card, we are quarantining more money to be spent on fresh food, on school excursions, sports gear, petrol for the car. The cashless debit card, as we have heard, has been operating in the Ceduna, South Australia, since the 15th of March 2016, East Kimberley, Western Australia, since April 2016, the Goldfields, Western Australia, since March 2018, and Bundaberg and Hervey Bay in Queensland since January 2019. And with virtually no consultation, Labor has made it easier for those at risk to spend their taxpayer-funded payments on activities and substances that harm themselves, their families, their communities and society at large. I want to just finally touch on the community of Doomadgee, where there is an extraordinary group of elder women, stronger women. They are the ones who are taking in kids in unofficial kind of loose fostering arrangements from their own children, making sure that these kids have got food, that they're being dressed and they're going to school. I had a discussion with another senator from the north the other day, and we were worried about who is going to do that job for these young people when those elders are gone. Who is going to have been who is going to nurture and feed and ensure these children get to school so that they can access the potential and possibility that they have within themselves? Who is going to do that? And that is why the role of the cashless debit card and other social security measures that protect our children, that protect our vulnerable, that ensure that money is being spent where we as taxpayers are assuming it's being spent. Because this is not about individuals' rights to spend money wherever they want. This is about a protection, a social security safety net for communities that are disadvantaged by poverty, by lack of education, by remoteness, by other disadvantage. And in the first independent evaluation of the CDC in late 2017, the card has been shown to deliver considerable positive impact in the initial trial sites, including 41% of participants surveying who drank alcohol less frequently, 48% of participants surveyed who used drugs reported using them less frequently, and 48% of those who were gambling before the trial reported gambling less often. I mean, there have been dozens of evaluations of the cashless debit card that have provided consistent evidence about welfare quarantining policies that show positive impacts on communities, on the people who were previously victims of crime, but most importantly, on our children, on our vulnerable and their future.